Hello and welcome back to Sean in the Shed. On the show today, we've got Ade Lingard, who's the founder of North Peak Consulting. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean. Good to see you again.
So we always start out by describing whereabouts you were born, educated, and how you started out in your career. So perhaps you can describe that to the audience.
Sure, yeah. So I was born just south of Barnsley. Now I live just north of Barnsley. I think I moved about 10 miles. Worked all over the place, but always lived in the same area. I actually left school when I was 17 and went to work for Yorkshire Bank. So I didn't go to university. It was kind of something that I fell into, having a failed attempt at getting a scholarship to be a fighter pilot due to my poor eyesight. So that was never going to work for me. So I just fell into banking. My sister did it, so I thought, why not? It's a job, I'll give it a go. So I worked at Yorkshire Bank for a few years down in Barnsley in a branch, and that was amazing at the time. You know, branch banking. It seems such a hell of a long time ago now, and it certainly is. Culturally, it feels a million miles away. But I learned all sorts there. You know, I guess we were dealing with customers all the time. So how to treat people, how to deal with customers that were sometimes joyful, sometimes quite angry, frustrated, and also that we spend quite a lot of time at work, and how important it is to get on with everybody and build relationships with people. So they were probably my two biggest learnings. I ended up lending money there, so learning how to lend money, asking people questions the old-fashioned way in order to give them hard cash. So that was good. And then eventually, after about sort of 4 or 5 years, I got an opportunity to work for National Australia Group, who owned Yorkshire Bank at the time. They were putting a new computer system in across all the branches, and branches didn't particularly have great computer systems back then. No one worked really with computers. It was a very niche environment. So, you know, I was a bit geeky as a kid. I played about with computers a bit, so I managed to wing my way into this opportunity and ended up in the grand sort of bright lights of Leeds, working for National Australia Group with 40 people shipped over from the States implementing this new computer system. So that was great. So that took me to about 6 years in. And then I had an opportunity to go and work for First Direct up in Leeds. You know, the first telephone bank. I think everybody knows First Direct pretty well now. Seems crazy, doesn't it, talking about the first telephone bank now, when you know, everybody surpassed that and telephone banking's a thing of the past. You know, and it's only kind of around about 30 years ago that First Direct came into play. So I was there at a great growth time, and I was lending money, helping counsel people in financial difficulty, dealing with difficult conversations around, I'm sorry you can't go that far overdrawn, all that kind of stuff. So again, dealing with people. It was interesting then, Sean, was kind of, you know, we'd had the human face-to-face interaction removed. So we were just on the telephone, and I found that quite challenging at first, you know, making decisions when you couldn't actually, you know, see the people face-to-face. It removed a key human sense from us. There's some guys worked there at the time, and they started to replace as much of that as they could with data and information, sticking information upon a screen, which again seems really simple now, but it was quite innovative at the time. And they looked to go a step further and actually start automating lending decisions and loads of decisions about customers to help First Direct's crazy growth. The business was growing like crazy. Couldn't keep up with recruitment. And I got the opportunity as a kind of, as a lender, if you like, who again was a bit geeky, knew a bit about computers, quite interested, data analysis, all that kind of stuff, to go and use the data to make decisions. So that was probably my first sort of soiree into using data and information to make decisions that would affect human beings in the real world. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. Spent 6 years there. And then with the growth of data, some guys I knew I'd worked with at First Direct set up a consultancy business at the time called JWIN, Data and Analytics Consultancy, about 10 people based in Wakefield. I was number 11. Joined this little company, little data business, and worked there for quite a substantial period in my career. In the end, we're in a great place, you know. So data and analysis was growing in financial services. It had moved out of financial services into retail. You know, it's the data explosion really from sort of 2000 onwards. And I guess I was just fortunate to be a data person, a people person, and so worked in a consultancy that helped organizations and companies use data to make better decisions. So I spent around about sort of 15 years in that bit of the business. It was sold halfway through that tenure. I was fortunate to be managing director of the data consultancy practice with about 70 people after we'd built it up. and done work for all sorts of fantastic brands and clients with an amazing team of hugely intellectual people. A friend of mine once said to me that if you get a job you enjoy doing, you'll never have to work again. And that kind of was that job for me. It was brilliant. That took me up to about 2015. And then I was very fortunate, having run that practice successfully, to be asked to join the board at J-Wing and be COO, which I did, and joined some other great directors there, and really enjoyed my time as COO. I guess at that point it was quite interesting that for me, the role profile said I need to do a load of stuff, which I did. But what's also interesting is what's not in the role profile. What can you do to make it thoroughly enjoyable for you and to use your own strengths and your own skills and bring them to the job? So my stuff was always around helping people, working with clients. So that's what I did. And I continued to do that up to earlier this year, actually. I decided to leave the company around about October, November last year, set up my own consulting practice. Bit inspired by my wife setting up her own business a few years ago, and being a bit jealous of that. Always thought I'd do that myself one day. And so I started to think maybe now is the time, instead of waiting until I'm a bit older. Maybe I should do it now while I still feel like I've got enough energy to give it a good push. So that's kind of how I sort of concluded my career there earlier this year. And then it took a little bit of a change, really, I guess, to get to where I am now, in that I decided I wanted to help people improve and help businesses improve. I do some strategic advisory work for a couple of companies. So I work with a couple of great Yorkshire companies, Hatmill, who are supply chain specialists. And I also work with a company called Data Consulting in Wakefield, who are a data analytics specialist. In particular, work with a lot of internal audit teams, but make sense out of data. And I launched some development programs, coaching-based development programs. And I guess it's that bit that's been the big learning for me, the kind of pursuit of learning non-directive coaching skills. I'm registered with the European Mentoring and Coaching Council as a coach, and I've built my own development programs for leaders, aspiring leaders, rational people that I can work with in this way, over Zoom, over Teams, whatever, and help individuals improve their performance, tapping into some of the softer skills, which are often the hardest to learn, such that they can move forward and help their business.
It's an interesting story, isn't it? Because the theme of today's show is all going to be about emotional intelligence. And there are different routes in life, aren't there, when it comes to your career? But ultimately, you rose to the top of an AIM-listed company without going to university, actually going into banking and then finding your own path. So talk to us about the importance of emotional intelligence and getting on with people, and your character in getting to the dizzy heights of a listed company.
Sure, yeah, and I think the most important thing to say, first of all, is you do see a lot of kind of arguments around IQ versus EQ, and I'm not about to kind of jump in and feel that, I've worked with highly intellectual people for many, many years, and they are superb, individuals. IQ is incredibly important. I'm not subscribed to the fact that it's not important. But once you've got whatever IQ you've got and whatever personality you've got it. You're kind of stuck with it, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. You can tweak it a little bit, particularly personality. You can round the edges off your Myers-Briggs profile or your DISC profile, but you are who you are to some degree. EQ is really different. So the thing that fascinated me when I was doing some of my coaching studies earlier this year down in London was starting to get into the research on emotional intelligence and the effect of the emotional quotient and what that's all about. And just for anybody who doesn't kind of know what it is, it's the kind of ability to understand ourselves, so self-perception, self-management, how we manage relationships, how we deal with stress, how we solve problems utilizing emotional information. And that bit's particularly key. How do we solve problems utilizing emotional information? How does it affect us positively or negatively? And, Dan Goleman is a kind of a leader in this field, and he talks about a slightly different model. It's highly correlated with the one that I use. The reason I use the EQ one I do is because that's what the qualification I've got in EQ through multi-health systems. We can test emotional intelligence utilizing those things. But I just think that for me, it's highly important because actually it can create the differentiation. It's how you work with people. It's how you relate to people. And I guess, if I look at myself and, thanks for your compliments about where I've got to, but it's come from EQ. You know, that's what it is. It's about being interested in other people, getting on with other people, working with other people, and utilizing that in your work. That they're the key skills in work, and they're the key skills in life. So I think EQ is absolutely vital in the modern workplace.
And is there an element of, you know, learning to count to 10 before you speak? You know, there's the famous book, you know, about the chimp paradox and keeping chimp in place. So you're an analytical person. So, you know, how have you adapted your style to communicate better with other people, perhaps extroverts that, you know, can get... You will have been in board meetings and various situations where, I don't know, the stock price is going down, there's high stress, that, you know, there's redundancies, maybe there's some fires that you've got to put out, and you've got to then be calm, collected. People are looking at your mood as one of the business leaders, and you know, that's setting the culture, the mood of the office. How do you manage your stress when that's going on, and how do you manage your own emotions, especially if you've got, I don't know, stuff going wrong at work, but also maybe stuff going wrong at home? How do you stay cool as a cucumber?
It's a really great question, and you actually answered it right at the beginning of what you said. You know, there's loads of fantastic things I've discovered in lots of research and studies over the last over 2020. Studying's been a key theme for me, and research. And, you know, there's lots of things that you kind of look at as these old tales and old proverbs and all the rest of it. Count to 10 is actually based in neuroscience. I mean, it's just great advice. You know, the definition of emotional intelligence, maturity, through Dan Goleman, who, as I say, is a leader in this field from a sort of self-management perspective, is maturity is about the gap between your initial thought and what you say. And as you develop your maturity, you do pause. And the reason you need to pause is because the first thing that happens is an emotional wave comes over you. And that emotional wave is going to dominate your thinking. Now, the good news is that, you know, it's only a minute or so before it's gone. Now, when it's gone, you might choose not to ignore it, but allow your rational brain, back to your Martin Peters, who's an amazing chap for your Chimp Paradox book. You know, take that moment, take that thought. It doesn't mean that you should ignore that initial thought, but understand what it is. Understand it's an emotional reaction. Unfortunately, you know, we haven't evolved hugely from a kind of neuroscience perspective over the years. We're still kind of dominated by what we were given through initial evolution. And so, you know, the kind of fight or flight thing is still in us. You know, we're wired to actually respond really, really quickly. We have to work really hard not to. In terms of how I would have dealt with that, you know, in those board meetings and all those situations, I was very fortunate that I worked with a good board that had good debate and good discussion and didn't promote a kind of highly charged environment. So that was really strong. But in answering it honestly, I deal with it a lot better today following all the work I've done over the last 9 months than I would have done 2 years ago. And that's what learning is about, isn't it? It's about lifelong learning and kind of, you know, always being interested in learning. So, yeah.
Absolutely, that's interesting. So if you've just joined us, you're watching Sean in the Shed, and on the show today we've got Ade Lingard, who's the founder of North Peak Consulting, and we're talking about emotional intelligence. So if you've got friends, family, contacts and others that might be interested in this video, do tag them in the comment stream, and you can hashtag share Sean in the Shed on social media. We are looking for future guests to the show, so do direct message me here on LinkedIn if you're interested. But the question that myself and Ade would like to ask you, the audience, today is, what is the difference between EQ and IQ? We were just talking about that just then. So if you've got thoughts, opinion, ideas on that, do fill in the comment stream. But let's fire that question back to you, Ade. What is the difference? Because IQ is, I guess, how intellectually clever I am. And there's various tests you can do of that. I saw recently a newspaper comparing the world leaders and their IQs. And then you've got the EQ, which is, once armed with that intelligence, how do you deal with people? And business is very much about managing people, isn't it? Most businesses are people dependent. So talk us through those differences and why you think it matters when it comes to career management, growth, and fulfillment, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. And we talked a little bit about it already, but effectively the intellectual quotient, as I say, you develop it at a fairly early age. You've kind of got what you've got. You know, my age, you've kind of got what you've got. And personality is very similar. And I want to make that point because people often think EQ, all right, we're talking about personality. I've done Myers-Briggs. It's really different to personality. It's a skill that you can learn and it's malleable. And with your EQ, you can effectively look at the various components, and the model that I work with has got around about 15 components in it within the 5 things I talked about earlier: self-perception, self-management, etc. But it's all about relationships, and the reason I'm passionate about this work, I guess, Sean, it's kind of, why is the guy with a data and analytical background banging on about this kind of softer skills? Well, I just think it's vital. Data is a key currency of business now and will be for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And lots of data rational people have got a really high IQ. And that's absolutely wonderful. We need that. But how you communicate that data, how you use that data, how you understand the impact it's going to have on other people, that's going to be the difference between, great success and just doing okay. And so for me, EQ is really important. It's important for leaders. You've got to understand where your team are. It doesn't mean that you have to go with where they are. Within the model, it's looking at kind of how you deal with assertiveness, how you deal with independence of thought, and a variety of different things. But you've got to understand where people are in order to make your own decisions, in order to take your team with you. I often talk to people about there's no point in standing in a corner, a metaphorical corner, shouting to people in the other corner, oh, you come over here, it's great where I'm stood. You have to walk over there. You have to talk to them, put your arm around them and get them to walk to the other corner with you. And that requires emotional intelligence. It requires good understanding of people. It doesn't require a high IQ. And what you find as a leader is lots of leaders have got great IQs anyway. The differentiating factor is EQ. Differentiates success from failure.
So let's test that a little bit more, because changing a person and changing their habits is like one of the hardest things to do as a leader. So you might have a subordinate or a manager, a co-worker that could be a bit brash, maybe throws toys out of the pram, might be passive aggressive, might be doing this and might not be actually aware that they're doing it, and the effect it's having on the overall team. How do you approach that person to change their ways? Is it better that they're in an open office, a closed office? We're all working from home. Is it now less of an issue that we're not working together? But how do you approach that from a leadership and management stance?
You can't just lock them in a shed. It's not allowed. So my view on that is, first of all, understand who you are. So it's okay asking everybody else to do anything, but the easiest person to change, first of all, is yourself. Everything starts from self-awareness. And we talked a little bit earlier about, some of the ways I manage myself, which, I was pleased with how I've managed myself in business over the years and made lots of friends and got on with lots of people. But you're always learning. And I think the ability to reflect and be self-aware is hugely important. And if there's one thing I could go back and do back in my old business, it would have been to implement a kind of really positive feedback culture. A constant feedback culture, not a monthly one-to-one where we have a little chat with somebody about how well they're doing or not and tell them as their manager whether they're doing a great job or not. But if, for example, maybe we should do it when we finish this, Sean, I'll tell you how well I think I've done in this interview. And then I'll tell you something, something I've done really well, a couple of things I've done really well. And then maybe I'll tell you something that I could have done better. I'll self-reflect. And then maybe you can share your thoughts of a couple of things I did well and something that I could maybe think about for future. And for me, that little nugget of a feedback loop is just an amazing way of businesses moving forward and of having a constant learning culture, so it doesn't become brutal. The problem with feedback in many businesses is we hold off. We think we're aligned. We're not actually aligned. We just get on with each other really well. But it doesn't mean we agree. We just don't bring things up because we get on well. So actually having that kind of learning culture where, start with self-reflection first. Ask people to self-reflect. Do a project, PIR. What do you think? Well, I was running it. Here's what I think went really well, a couple of things. And here's what I think we could improve on. And don't dwell on the negative. We're wired again to dwell on the negative. We always look for the gap. What's the problem with me? Human beings, we're not problems waiting to be fixed. We're just full of opportunity waiting to be released. So let's focus on that.
And like you said, change your approach if you want to change the results. So perhaps you're having a difficult conversation with a colleague or someone that works for you, and the message isn't being delivered effectively. Maybe there's a lack of clarity, or for whatever reason, the message isn't being delivered, and it could be quite a serious situation. How do you change your approach, but also keep your integrity and be true to yourself? Because sometimes managers and leaders get nervous, lose sleep over it. They've got to have a difficult conversation with a challenging individual where that message is not ringing true. These people could have massively high IQs. They could be knowledge workers within a business. They might sometimes be single points of failure, whereby if they were to leave the business, it would be a disaster for the company. Yet actually, you've got to change that person through interpersonal skills, through emotional intelligence. If you've got an approach and it's not working, how do you change your approach? And do you go in hard? Do you pause? Do you ask better questions? What's your advice, Ade?
So I would say, first of all, stay calm. Back to your advice, count to 10. That's your first thing. Nothing's gained from an escalation in emotion. So there's nothing gained from the reaction followed by the reaction followed by the next reaction. It's almost like a price war, isn't it? Who's winning in that game? It's just an emotions war. So no one's winning there. So I think the first thing is to listen to what the other person's got to say. Personally, I would just let them talk. And I'd listen. And when I say listen, I mean listen. Another thing that, I've kind of enjoyed out of my studies is I was taught to listen. I thought I knew how to listen, but I've done quite a lot of studying now to listen, Sean. That's been really interesting. My wife says I should perhaps deploy it at home a little bit more, but nonetheless, listening is a really key skill. Really tuning into somebody, understanding what they're saying, and understand what's going on for them. Where are they coming from? And then following that listening, I'd probably even pause when they've when they've finished. Allow them to just come down a little bit, allow them to pause and reflect on the performance that they've just delivered. And then maybe ask them an open question. Clearly that's really, really bothering you. That feedback doesn't resonate for you. Can you just talk to me about it? Help me understand it a bit more. Help me understand your perspective. And there's something in there about asking open questions and deploying. And I would say this, I'm a registered coach, but there's something in there about deploying a coaching style. If that doesn't work, then potentially look at the other styles that you can deploy. There's 6 styles of leadership. Again, a big part of some of the work and research that I've been doing, 6 different styles of leadership. And I used to think a number of years ago that I had to have a style and I had to go for that one. Well, it's not true at all. If I don't have that style, I'm not myself. That's not right. You've got to have your own values, your own ways of working, but understanding which style to deploy in what situation is really important. There's an authoritative style, there's a democratic style, there's a coercive style, there's a coaching style. And the best leaders actually can dance the dance throughout all the styles and choose which to deploy and when. It's about having them all in your kit bag and knowing which to bring to the forefront in certain circumstances. Understanding that such a thing as a coercive style, for example, is really damaging to culture over time. So by all means, pull it out of the bag, but understand that this is not something that you can do on a regular basis and have a nurturing culture that's going to deliver brilliant people and great performance in your organization. It might serve you well now and again.
I think that's right. There'll be times where, the house is on fire and you've got to be autocratic and quite directive, but much better if you're consultative and democratic in how you manage those people. Let's take another scenario. There'll be members of the audience listening thinking, I'm quite careerist. I want to earn more money. I want to be more fulfilled. And as you go up in an organization, you've got the pyramid, the classic triangle. And ultimately, for the top jobs, there's more competition and there's less of them. So let's talk about, Ade, how do you differentiate yourself when it comes to emotional intelligence to go for those top jobs? Because if you've got 2 candidates and they've got equal IQ, the EQ is going to affect their career. Career advancement comes down to 2 things: your drive for results and your relationship with your boss. So if your results are great, but you've got a terrible relationship with co-workers and your boss, you're not going to get that promotion. So talk us through some hints and tips, because you've clearly been promoted several times over the years. What sort of tactics would you deploy to just help that career advancement? Maybe there's some schoolboy errors that get made over the years, and some really silly things that we say or do. And how can you eradicate those? things?
Yeah, I think if you work for a good organisation, the first thing is, I think you can't stamp your way to the top. You've got to get on with people. And getting on with people is emotional intelligence. We can put kind of tags on things, and we can put analysis behind it, and do all the kind of assessments that I do and all the rest of it. Fundamentally, you've got to understand people, get on with people, be able to express yourself, and be able to take people with you. If you want to lead, you need to take people with you. You can't bully them into coming with you. So I think, first of all, in order to help you develop those skills, the first thing is understanding yourself. So self-awareness is really, really critical. Are you aware of how you are, who you are, how you impact other people? Oh, there's a wonderful thing. I was talking to a senior guy in a director in one of the big banks a couple of weeks ago. We were chatting about my work and what I'm doing. And I said to him, it's really important that people understand the impact that they're having on others. And he said, yes, Ade, and it's really important they understand the impact they're not having on others. And I thought, you know what? That's a brilliant point. Sometimes we think that we're having an impact on other people, and we're just not having an impact whatsoever. So self-awareness is critical. You can just go, if you have a look online, you can Google emotional intelligence. There'll be Goleman's model there, or there's the EQI2 model, both worth looking at. I've worked with coaches before I was qualified to kind of do a professional assessment of it, and suggested to people that they just score where they think they are out of 10. Where do you think you are on these 15 composites? And let's have a conversation about it. Now, there's a fundamental flaw in that process. The fundamental flaw in that process is one of the composites is self-perception. So if you're pretty weak at perceiving yourself and you score yourself 10 out of 10, that's not great, is it? So maybe find a little buddy at work, somebody you get on really well with, who you can have an open conversation with. If you're motivated to develop and improve, find someone else, do an assessment with the other person, score it up yourself out of 10, get them to score themselves out of 10, score each other, go into a private and confidential conversation where you agree you're there to help each other and not start judging each other, and hold a conversation around, oh, you scored me 2 less than I scored myself. I thought I was, really good at being with my empathy. I thought I showed great empathy, Sean. You'd turn around and say, well, actually, Ade, I said something to you the other day and you weren't listening. It wasn't quite right for me, and here's how I felt about it. If you want to learn, get ready for the conversations that are involved in learning. But what's wrong with that with somebody who you know and get on with? It's a fantastic way to reflect. And upon that self-reflection and asking other people to help you out with that, you can baseline where you are, and then you can look at how you can improve those skills. And interestingly, I know we've not talked about this before, I assessed my own emotional intelligence as part of my studies in April, and it was reassessed again in August when I was qualified. And I saw a difference in what I'd worked on. What I also found really fascinating was I'd pick one particular skill to home in on and to spend time on. I've seen a couple of others that were a bit lower than I wanted, and I wanted them to improve. But I thought I'll park those for now because they're not as important as this other one. They also went up over the period. And the reason they went up over the period is once you make me aware of something, I can't ignore it. So self-awareness is a great start to improvement.
And with self-awareness, now that we've got Zoom meetings and perhaps they're getting recorded, is it worthwhile being sad enough to play back Zoom meeting to see how you perform? Because we're on Shaun in the Shed now. I don't like it, but I'm looking at myself quite a lot. So just by doing Shaun in the Shed, I'm now more aware because I can see when I frown and how I look, and am I listening attentively or am I slightly distracted? So perhaps in this period of time, this pandemic, the ability to play back conversations on pre-recorded video meetings might help bring about new levels of EQ. Ade?
Maybe. I think the interesting thing about that is that, so as part of my first certificate I did in coaching with the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, you had to record yourself, you had to watch it back, and it's awful, isn't it? It's awful. So what I would say to anybody that looks to do that, because I'm not a big believer in focusing on the negatives, I'm a big believer in looking for the positives, then watch 2 or 3 first before you start judging yourself. So watch 2 or 3 to get used to the fact that you really don't like watching yourself first, and then start looking at it, because I think there's some difficult challenges in those first couple. You could be very self-critical.
And just to finish off this topic of EQ and emotional intelligence, dealing with people, perhaps in charged or difficult situations, because when the going's good, anyone can stand at the top of the mountain, wave the flag and say, look at how well we've done. It's when it's going bad that you need real character. How do you personally, decide whether to fight a battle or not within a business? And when should conversations be private versus public? When it comes to some of those conversations that you've got to have that perhaps are uncomfortable, where to get the business result, you've got to slightly damage relationships, or you've got to make people feel uncomfortable and get them out of their comfort zone?
Take it on before it becomes a battle would be my answer. So, battles aren't great, are they? They're full of bodies littered in places. So, let's try and put a mechanism in place that can spot these things. Back to feedback loops, regular conversation, communication with the human beings. Let's be supportive, but also challenging. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that no one should be challenging. I am a big believer in all my coaching work. We set objectives. I work with the coaches. They agree the actions they're going to pursue, and I'll hold them to account on pursuing those actions. It's in a very calm way. But if they agree they're going to do something, then my expectation is that they'll do it. And I think it's the same in business. Set realistic, reasonable expectations, some challenge in there, some challenging goals. Ask people to do things, tell them to come and talk to you, and ask you if they need your help, and then expect that it's sorted. And if people aren't performing that way, then you have to take that conversation on. You should take that conversation on where you can in private. I don't think anything comes from good comes from a big war in a boardroom. I think taking those conversations in private, first of all, is the way to do it. And ultimately, if you've got corporate duties and that's not getting you where you need to be, then you absolutely have to escalate it, bring it up in the boardroom in a calm, measured manner.
And I suppose ultimately, if you've got a career path that's clear, perhaps for the next 2 to 3 years, where you've got your personal objectives and the business objectives are aligned, such as a tube map with a train on it, and you can sort of articulate they're the milestones we've got to hit, then you've got that clarity, haven't you? And then it's much easier to manage expectations. Perhaps it's easier to manage conflict, but also manage career development, because it's crystal clear. As we come towards the end of the show now, let's talk about your top 3 tips for getting through this crisis. It's been tough, both in terms of health, physical, mental health, but also economically. So, Ade, what would your top 3 tips be for getting through the next 3 to 6 months before we get back to hopefully some sort of new normal, or things where we can get on a plane, a train, and go and enjoy ourselves sociably?
Sure, and you've had some, I've been watching your show, and you've had some great top tips on there from people. So I'm trying to steer away from some of the things that have already been said, really. And you just mentioned a plane there. Do you remember when we used to get on aeroplanes? It was a wonderful, wonderful time that was. And one of the things there was, if you remember being on the aircraft and the stewards and stewardesses giving the speech at the beginning, if there's any aircraft decompression, then please fit your own mask first before helping others. And I'd offer that advice to leaders. There's a very important reason for that. You can't look after the kind of the health, the well-being, the performance of others if you don't look after your own first. So please do self-reflect. Make sure you've got time, a little bit of time. Nobody works well when they're 100% full. And look after yourself first in order to be able to be in a good state to look after and lead your team. You can't do it unless you do. So that would be the first one. The second one, really, I guess a bit of a COVID specific one, and back to my coaching work and scaling everything. I'm a coach, but I'm also a numbers man. So I like to scale everything. So one of the first questions I'll ask people when I work with them is, how's your resilience? Give me a score out of 10. How is it at the minute? How's your confidence? Give me a score out of 10. So, if I'm looking at, I was debating this with a very analytical friend of mine the other day, and I said, I'd like to understand where people were starting and what COVID's done to them. So in order to understand where they are now, think about your team and think about where they start. So if you've got someone who's hugely resilient normally and hugely confident, if they're a 9 out of 10 on both, and they're kind of having a normal COVID experience, whatever that means, maybe it's a -2 in general. So maybe they're operating at a 7, but they're okay. If you've got somebody who typically operates at a 6 or 7 out of 10, not as confident, not as resilient, and that they've got some challenging personal circumstances, maybe kids have been at home all the time, and granny's not well, or whatever it happens to be, it might hit them -3 or 4. So I think understand where people are starting normally, understand the impact of COVID in order to connect with where they might be now. Because I know I've spoken to quite a few leaders who've said, I just find it a bit odd. It's just quite challenging just to speak to everybody and just, try and get under the skin of what COVID is doing to them. So I just advise, look at where they were, look at what you know about their situation, and that might help you reflect on that a little bit. And I guess the final one is just sort of, back to what you're doing. You've jumped into the shed on COVID and gone and done something different. And myself, I'm doing a load of coaching, and all my work was intended to be online as well. So within there's some good. So I guess in challenging and difficult circumstances, there's always something to be had. There's always something positive, and there's always something good. We are wired to look for the problems and the negative. Go and find the good and go and crack on with it.
And talking about self-awareness, I clearly have no self-awareness because I've got these headphones on and they're not even turned on, Ade, would you believe? So I don't actually know. So I'll take those. So that's my summary on self-awareness. But that importance around self-deprecation, the ability to not take life too seriously, to use comedy and humor to get through those stressful times is also another good emotional trait if you can do that, not to be the laughing stock or the village idiot, but to sometimes self-deprecate is useful, as I've just done then. But so if members of the audience want to connect with you, Ade, you're clearly on LinkedIn. What's the best website address? How do they connect with you?
Yeah, so my company is northpeakconsulting.com, and you can email me there by all means as well. There's a few sort of items on the blog, things we talked about, just you mentioned there. There's the thing about how to be successful through looking at your strengths, not your weaknesses. So they can connect with me through there. If anybody wants any of the kind of sort of self-assessment materials for them to look at their own emotional intelligence with their friends, drop me a note and I'll send something over to you by all means.
Ade, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. It's fantastic that you didn't go to university and you rose to the top of an AIM-listed business. It's absolutely fantastic. And it shows you how far emotional intelligence can get you. So it's definitely a topic worth learning and exploring. Thank you to Ade for coming on the show today. Thank you to you, the audience, for watching Sean in the Shed. And we'll see you next week. Bye for now.